A blinding winter wind swept the coast as a former Navy SEAL and his rare silver-gray German Shepherd reached a so-called worthless rock in the frozen sea. His family had mocked him out of a fortune, leaving only a lonely treehouse on a cliff and a dog no one wanted. He came for silence. Instead, his dog growled and scratched at the stone, sensing something buried deep below. That hidden secret was powerful enough to draw greedy men, foreign hunters, and a storm strong enough to erase them all. Walking away would have kept him safe. Revealing the truth could cost him everything. He chose the watch. What he didn't know was this: the secret his dog uncovered would turn that worthless rock into the most dangerous place on the coast. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if stories of loyalty, courage, and second chances move you, please subscribe for more. Winter had a way of stripping Seattle down to its bones. On that morning, the city stood exposed beneath a hard, brilliant skyline, the kind that made the cold feel intentional rather than accidental. Snow fell in fine, dry sheets, coating shoulders and rooftops alike, dusting the steel and glass skyline until it looked almost fragile. Traffic moved slower than usual, tires hissing over slush, breath rising from pedestrians like quiet confessions. It was a beautiful cold, but unforgiving, an honest cold that punished hesitation. Ethan Walker walked through it without hurry. He was 35, tall and broad-shouldered, his build lean rather than bulky, the result of years spent carrying weight through places where survival depended on efficiency, not show. His face was angular, with a sharp jawline and high cheekbones that gave him a perpetually serious expression, even at rest. A short, neatly trimmed beard shadowed his mouth and chin, more habit than fashion, streaked faintly with early gray that matched the winter around him. His eyes were a clear steel blue, alert, measuring. The eyes of a man trained to notice exits, reflections, and hands that lingered too long in pockets. He wore his Navy working uniform despite being long out of active service. The digital camouflage was immaculate, every seam crisp, the fabric worn soft through use but meticulously maintained. For Ethan, the uniform wasn't nostalgia, it was armor. Since leaving the teams, it was the one thing that kept the noise in his head organized, the memories aligned. Without it, the world felt too loose, too loud. The law office of Sterling and Howe occupied the top floor of a restored historic building overlooking Elliott Bay. Inside, the warmth was artificial and heavy, scented with polished wood, old paper, and money that had been sitting still for decades. Thick carpets swallowed footsteps. Dark mahogany panels lined the walls like a coffin turned inside out. Ethan disliked the place instantly. It felt sealed, airless, like a bunker designed to keep truth out rather than danger. Behind the main desk sat Harold Sterling, the senior partner. A man in his late 70s whose skin had thinned to parchment over sharp bones. His hair was white and meticulously combed, his mouth a narrow line that rarely softened. He had the careful manners of someone who had spent a lifetime dealing with powerful families and learned early that emotions complicated transactions. His eyes, pale and observant, lingered on Ethan's uniform for a fraction of a second longer than polite, as if cataloging him as both anomaly and inconvenience. To Sterling's right sat Brad Carter. Ethan's cousin was everything Ethan was not. Where Ethan's posture was straight and economical, Brad slouched back in his chair with rehearsed ease. He was in his early 30s, shorter and softer, his physique padded by comfort rather than effort. His expensive suit strained slightly at the waist, tailored well enough to hide excess but not discipline. His hair was dark blonde, slicked neatly into place, and his face carried a permanent half-smile, the kind that suggested confidence born from inheritance rather than accomplishment. Brad's eyes were light, restless, and when they met Ethan's, they slid away with practiced indifference. They had not spoken in years, not since Ethan enlisted against the family's wishes, choosing service over the shipping fortune that had quietly fed generations of Crofts and Carters. To Brad, Ethan was the cautionary tale, the one who walked away from wealth and came back with nothing but scars and principles that didn't earn interest. Sterling cleared his throat and began reading the will of Julian Walker, Ethan's grandfather. The old man had been distant, even cold, for most of Ethan's life, more presence than comfort, more watcher than participant. Memories of him came in fragments, salt-stiff jackets, hands rough with calluses, eyes always scanning the horizon as if expecting something to break the line between sea and sky. The assets were listed in a steady, emotionless cadence. Properties, investments, shares in shipping lanes and logistics companies. Each line landed squarely in Brad's column. With every bequest, Brad's smile widened just a fraction, his foot tapping lightly against the polished floor, a subtle rhythm of victory. Ethan listened without reaction. He felt no loss. The numbers meant nothing to him. He had already walked away from them once. Then Sterling paused. The silence stretched just long enough to draw a breath. "For my grandson, Ethan Walker," Sterling read, peering over his glasses. "I leave my property known as Seawolf Ledge, located off the coast of Maine, including the old growth tree upon it and the structure built therein. I also entrust to his care my dog, Scout." Brad let out a short laugh, sharp and dismissive. "That's it?" he said, unable to stop himself. "A rock in a treehouse? You've got to be kidding." Sterling shot him a warning glance but continued. Ethan's attention narrowed on the final lines, the way it always did when something mattered. "This bequest," Sterling read slowly, "is made with a specific understanding. Ethan alone knows the value of a silent watch. He must keep it before others hear." The words struck Ethan harder than any number ever could. Silent watch, it wasn't poetic, it was operational language. Nights spent unmoving in hostile territory, hours of listening rather than acting, a discipline understood only by those who had lived inside it. His grandfather had known. Somehow, impossibly, he had known. Brad shook his head, amusement tipping into disdain. "The old man finally lost it," he muttered. "Unless there's buried treasure out there, you've been officially written off, cousin." Ethan said nothing. He felt the familiar tightening between his shoulders, the subtle shift as instinct woke and asked a question his mind had not yet formed. The meeting ended quickly after that. Brad left first, cologne lingering behind him like a challenge. Sterling remained, pushing a slim folder across the desk. "Your grandfather arranged minimal funds for maintenance," he said quietly, "enough for supplies, and for the dog's care until you arrived." "What kind of dog?" Ethan asked. "A German Shepherd," Sterling replied. 5 years old, unusual coloring, gray and silver. The fisherman who's been checking on the property says the animal hasn't left the shoreline since your grandfather passed." That night, Seattle glowed cold and beautiful beneath streetlights that turned falling snow into drifting sparks. Ethan walked alone, hands buried in his coat, uniform collar turned up against the wind. His phone vibrated once. An unknown number. One message. "Don't go to the island. Your grandfather didn't die of old age." Ethan stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, snow settling silently on his shoulders as the city moved around him, unaware that something ancient had just shifted. Ethan left Seattle before dawn, the city still locked in its brittle winter quiet, and by nightfall, he was crossing the country toward a colder, sharper edge of America. The flight to Maine felt longer than it was, turbulence rattling the cabin like distant artillery, but Ethan barely noticed. He spent most of it staring out the window, replaying the anonymous message in his mind, testing it the way he once tested intel, turning it over, looking for seams. By the time he landed and rented a truck, snow had already begun to fall again, lighter here but more purposeful, as if the land expected it. Port Clyde greeted him the next morning, under a sky washed clean by cold sunlight. The harbor town was small and working class, its buildings low and weathered, painted in muted whites and blues that reflected the winter brightness rather than fought it. Snow sat on rooftops like sifted flour, undisturbed except where chimneys exhaled thin columns of smoke. The sea beyond the pier was a deep, honest blue, flat but tense, the kind of calm that never promised kindness. Everything here felt exposed. No skyscrapers, no glass, nothing to hide behind. Ethan found he liked that. He parked near the docks and stepped out into the cold, his boots crunching on frost-hardened planks. The smell hit him first. Salt, diesel, old rope, and fish. Clean in its bluntness. At the far end of the pier stood a man repairing a net, his movements slow but practiced. Jed Miller was in his late 60s, tall and spare, his frame bent slightly forward, as if shaped by decades of wind rather than age. His face was deeply lined, skin tanned and roughened to the color of driftwood. A thick gray beard covered most of his jaw, trimmed short out of habit, and his eyes were a pale, watery blue that missed very little. He wore a heavy wool sweater stained with oil and brine, and his hands, gnarled and scarred, worked the net with a gentleness that contradicted their strength. "You must be Walker," Jed said without looking up, his voice low and gravelly, like stones shifting beneath tidewater. "Ethan," he replied, extending a hand. Jed wiped his palm on his trousers and took it, his grip firm and assessing, the handshake of someone who had learned long ago how to read men quickly. "Your grandfather was a quiet one," Jed said. "Didn't talk much, but he watched, always watched." There was no sentimentality in his tone, only respect. He nodded toward the end of the pier. "He left something for you." Scout stood there, exactly where Jed had gestured. The German Shepherd was large even by the breed standards, his body powerful without being bulky, all clean lines and contained force. His coat was striking, layers of silver gray and pale white that caught the winter light and seemed to shift with every small movement, like storm clouds over open water. His ears were erect, alert, and his posture was so still it bordered on unnatural. Amber eyes fixed on Ethan with quiet intensity. There was no wagging tail, no excited pacing. This was not a dog greeting a stranger. It was a sentry evaluating a relief watch. Ethan felt his breath slow as he approached. He crouched deliberately, lowering himself to Scout's level, mindful not to rush the moment. "Hey," he said softly, palm open. "I'm Ethan." Scout moved forward just enough to close the distance, his steps soundless on the wood. He leaned in, touched his cool nose to Ethan's fingers, and inhaled once, deeply. The contact lasted no more than a second, but something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or agreement. Then Scout stepped back and sat, tail giving a single, slow thump against the pier. "He's been like that since Julian passed," Jed said. "Wouldn't leave the dock, wouldn't get on the boat with anyone else, figured he was waiting." He studied Ethan again, eyes narrowing slightly. "Seems he chose right." The boat was small but solid, a blue-hulled motorboat scarred by years of work. Its paint was chipped, its metal fittings dulled by salt, but it sat steady in the water, built for function rather than appearance. Jed showed Ethan the engine, simple, reliable, and the storage compartment stocked with fuel, water, and basic supplies. "Weather's good enough," he said, glancing at the sky. "Bright, but don't let that fool you. The sea doesn't care how clear the day looks." Scout leapt into the stern with effortless grace and settled at the bow, facing forward. Ethan cast off, the engine coughing once before settling into a steady hum, and the harbor began to slip away behind them. Port Clyde grew smaller, its neat lines dissolving into pale shapes against the snow, until there was nothing but water and sky. Seawolf Ledge revealed itself slowly, first as a dark line against the horizon, then as a jagged rise of granite punching up through the Atlantic. It looked less like land and more like something the ocean had failed to finish swallowing. At its highest point stood a massive old tree, its trunk thick and twisted, roots clawing into stone as if refusing to be claimed by sea or time. Built into its branches was the treehouse, weathered wood silvered by salt and sun, perched high but improbably stable, as though it had grown there rather than been constructed. As they drew closer, the air seemed to change. The engine noise felt louder, the silence heavier around it. Scout rose to his feet, muscles tensing beneath his coat, a low sound beginning deep in his chest. Not a bark, not yet a growl, but a warning hum. Ethan throttled back and guided the boat toward the narrow stone landing his grandfather had marked on the map. The hull scraped gently against rock, and the engine fell quiet. For a moment, there was only the sound of water slapping against granite and the cry of a gull somewhere overhead. Then Scout froze, his ears angled forward, his head turning slowly toward the far side of the ledge. The hum in his chest deepened into a growl, low and deliberate, vibrating through the cold air. Ethan followed his gaze. Against the bright, reflective sea, something moved, subtle enough to miss if you weren't looking for it. A small, black inflatable raft drifted just beyond the curve of the rock, its motor silent, its surface barely rippling the water. No one sat at its helm, no oars dipped. It simply floated there, as if waiting. Ethan's hand tightened on the boat's rail. The anonymous message echoed in his mind, sharper now. "Don't go to the island. Your grandfather didn't die of old age." Scout stepped off the boat onto the rock, placing himself between Ethan and the dark shape on the water. His posture was rigid, protective, eyes locked on the raft with unwavering focus. Whatever was out there, it had already been noticed and judged. Winter offshore was brighter than Ethan expected, a harsh, merciless brilliance that turned snow into glass and sea spray into needles of light. The sun hung low but unfiltered, reflecting off the granite and the water until every surface seemed sharpened. There was nowhere to hide from it, not even beneath the sprawling crown of the ancient tree that dominated Seawolf Ledge. Its trunk was massive, bark split and scarred by centuries of storms, roots gripping the rock like fingers refusing to let go. The treehouse clung to it high above the ground, a weathered structure of old timber and iron braces, its silhouette stubborn against the sciate. Ethan climbed the narrow wooden stairway that spiraled around the trunk. Each step protested under his weight, creaking with the tired voice of old wood, but the structure held firm. He moved with deliberate care, testing each plank before trusting it, the habits of a man who had learned the cost of assuming stability. Scout remained below, circling the base of the tree in wide, methodical arcs. His nose traced the seams of stone and root, his tail still, ears constantly adjusting to sounds too faint for human hearing. Inside the treehouse, the air was dry and unexpectedly warm, the scent of cedar and old paper cutting through the salt. Light poured in through narrow windows cleaned so recently that the glass gleamed. That was the first thing that unsettled Ethan. There was no dust on the desk, no mildew creeping along the corners, no sign of abandonment beyond the age of the materials themselves. A sturdy work table stood against one wall, its surface marked with faint pencil lines and compass arcs. Nautical charts were pinned above it, edges worn but carefully aligned, their markings precise. A small iron stove sat cold but clean, ash neatly swept from its base. Everything suggested presence, not memory, as if someone had been here not weeks ago, but hours. Ethan set his pack down and moved through the space, cataloging details the way he once cleared rooms overseas. One chair slightly out of place, a mug by the window, dry but not dusty. A faint indentation on the floor where boots had been set repeatedly. His grandfather had been meticulous, yes, but this was something else. This was maintenance. He stepped back onto the narrow balcony that wrapped around the treehouse and scanned the horizon. The sea was calm but tense, the surface too smooth for comfort. The black inflatable raft he had seen earlier was gone. No wake, no trace, just empty water reflecting the blinding winter sun. Below, Scout stopped abruptly. His head snapped toward the rock face near the largest roots, his body stiffening. He moved closer, sniffing hard, then circled again, faster this time. Ethan descended the stairs and joined him, boots crunching on frost. "What is it?" Ethan asked quietly, though he already felt the answer coiling in his chest. Scout let out a short bark, sharp, clipped, not alarm but instruction. He scratched once at a patch of moss-covered stone near where the tree's roots disappeared into the granite, then stepped back and stared at Ethan, eyes intent. Ethan crouched and pressed his gloved hand against the rock. At first, there was nothing, just cold, unyielding stone. Then he felt it. A subtle vibration, so faint it could have been imagined, a low thrumming that passed through his palm and into his bones. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't random. It felt rhythmic, like breathing slowed to an inhuman pace. He pulled his hand back slowly. The line from the journal echoed in his mind. When the snow is brightest, that is when the darkness draws near. A sound drifted across the ledge then, soft, irregular, unmistakable. Footsteps. Ethan straightened, every muscle tightening. The sound came again, wood on wood, faint but clear from the direction of the stairway. Someone was climbing. He reached instinctively for a weapon that wasn't there, then shifted his stance, placing himself between Scout and the stairs. The footsteps paused. A shadow crossed the frosted railing above. "Hello?" a voice called out, female, cautious but steady. "I don't mean any trouble." Moments later, a woman appeared at the top of the steps. She was in her early 30s, average height but wiry, built lean rather than fragile. Her dark brown hair was pulled back into a practical braid, strands escaping to frame a narrow, wind-reddened face. Her skin was pale from the cold, freckled across the nose, and her eyes, hazel, sharp and observant, moved quickly, taking in Ethan, Scout, the tree, the ledge. She wore a heavy parka faded from use, sturdy boots crusted with snow, and gloves patched at the fingers. She looked like someone accustomed to working outdoors in bad weather, not a tourist who had wandered off course. "My name's Sarah Lowell," she said, raising her hands slightly, palms open. "I live in Port Clyde. I saw your boat earlier and thought, well, no one comes out here unless something's wrong." Her gaze flicked briefly to Scout, lingering there with a mix of respect and wariness. "Your dog nearly scared the life out of me." Scout growled low, stepping forward just enough to make his presence unmistakable. Ethan placed a hand on the dog's back, feeling the tension coiled beneath the silver-gray fur. "Easy," Ethan murmured, then looked back at Sarah. "This is private property." She nodded quickly. "I know. I wouldn't be here if I hadn't heard things." She hesitated, chewing on the inside of her cheek, a tell of uncertainty. "People talk about your grandfather, about lights out here at night, sounds that don't match the sea." Ethan studied her. There was no deceit in her posture, no nervous twitching that suggested she was hiding an agenda. She looked more concerned than curious, more cautious than bold. Still, he said nothing. "I'm a marine surveyor," Sarah continued, gesturing vaguely toward the water. "I map coastal erosion, tidal patterns. Been doing it since my husband died out there 3 winters ago." Her voice tightened slightly at the admission, grief held in check by long practice. "I learned to listen after that, to the water, to what doesn't feel right." Scout's growl softened but didn't stop. He shifted his weight, eyes never leaving Sarah. "I didn't come to snoop," she said quietly. "I came because something out there changed last night. The currents near the ledge, they behaved wrong, like something underneath them woke up." Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. He glanced toward the rock where he had felt the vibration. The subtle hum was gone now, or perhaps his body had simply stopped noticing it. Before he could respond, a sharp crack echoed through the air. Not thunder, wood. The sound came from above, from the treehouse. Both Ethan and Sarah looked up at the same time. Another crack followed, heavier this time, accompanied by the unmistakable creak of weight shifting where no one stood. Scout snapped his head back and let out a single bark, loud and commanding, then sprinted toward the stairs. Ethan followed, heart pounding, boots slipping slightly on the frost-hardened planks. They reached the balcony to find the chair by the desk rocking gently, as if someone had just stood up from it. The mug by the window rolled slowly onto its side and came to rest against the wall. No wind reached this height. The air was still. Sarah hovered at the doorway, her face pale now, eyes wide. "You feel that?" she whispered. Ethan nodded. The floor vibrated again, faint but undeniable, running through the tree and into the house like a distant pulse. Somewhere deep beneath the rock, something moved or waited. Scout planted himself in front of the desk, hackles raised, staring at the floorboards as if daring them to reveal what lay below. Ethan realized then that the footsteps they had heard did not belong to Sarah, and whatever had been keeping the house so carefully tended had not left at all. The vibration returned just after dusk, subtle but persistent, as if the rock beneath Seawolf Ledge had decided to answer the questions Ethan had not yet spoken aloud. The winter light faded into a pale silver glow, moonrise catching the snow and turning every edge sharp. Ethan stood near the base of the ancient tree, breath slow, navy working uniform dusted white, listening not with his ears alone but with the instincts that had once kept him alive in places far louder than this island. Scout stood beside him, head low, ears forward, silver-gray coat rippling slightly in the cold wind. The dog's focus was absolute. Whatever lay beneath the stone had his full attention. Ethan retrieved the crowbar from his pack, its steel cold enough to sting through his gloves. He wedged the flattened end into the narrow seam where moss-covered rock met root and granite. The stone resisted at first, silent and stubborn. Ethan leaned his weight into it, muscles tightening, jaw set. He felt the stone shift, not much, just enough to confirm what Scout already knew. With a low grinding sound that vibrated up through his arms, the slab tilted free. Beneath it lay a cavity that should not have existed. The space was dry, impossibly so, lined with dull gray metal panels fitted together with surgical precision. The air that escaped was cool and faintly metallic, untouched by salt or rot. Ethan felt a prickle run down his spine. This was not a hiding place made by an amateur. This was a vault. Inside were only 2 objects, The first was a journal wrapped tightly in oilcloth, its edges darkened with age but intact, preserved with care. The second was a heavy brass object that caught the moonlight and threw it back in warm, defiant gleams. Ethan lifted it slowly. It was not a key in the traditional sense, but a machined instrument, solid and deliberate, with a T-shaped handle and a cylindrical shaft cut with complex grooves and interlocking notches. It felt dense in his hand, heavier than it looked, the kind of weight that came from purpose rather than ornament. Scout leaned forward and sniffed the open cavity, then sat back on his haunches, eyes flicking between Ethan and the journal. His tail did not move. This was work. Ethan unwrapped the journal with careful fingers. The pages inside were thick, the handwriting precise and angular, the disciplined script of an engineer who valued clarity over flourish. He recognized it instantly, his grandfather's hand. The first entries were technical, dense with measurements, diagrams, and acoustic graphs. References to resonance, frequency mapping, and passive listening arrays filled the margins. Ethan read slowly, piecing together the truth with a growing sense of awe. Julian Walker had not been a reclusive eccentric tinkering on a rock. He had been a senior acoustic engineer for the U.S. Navy, part of a program designed to listen rather than strike, to detect threats long before they reach shore. A system meant for vigilance, not violence. Near the end of the journal, the tone shifted. The language became personal, stripped of formality. Julian wrote of disillusionment, of superiors who saw his work not as a shield but as a blade. He wrote of walking away, of choosing exile over complicity. Then came the final entry, the ink darker, pressed harder into the page. If the greedy arrive first, let the dog lead the way. Beneath it, a set of coordinates and a rough sketch of a symbol Ethan did not yet understand. Behind him, Sarah Lowell watched in silence. She had moved closer during the excavation, her earlier skepticism replaced by a taut, focused stillness. In the moonlight, her face looked sharper, the planes of her cheekbones more pronounced, her eyes reflecting both fear and fascination. She was not a woman easily rattled. Years spent on rough boats and colder nights had taught her control. But this was beyond erosion charts and tidal maps. "That's not survey equipment," she said quietly, nodding toward the metal-lined cavity. "That's military-grade containment." Ethan did not argue. He wrapped the journal again and secured it in his pack, then closed his hand around the brass key. "You were right," he said. "Something here woke up." Before Sarah could respond, Ethan's phone vibrated. A Chicago area code lit the screen. He didn't need to answer to know who it was. Brad Carter had always called at inconvenient moments, as if asserting dominance through timing alone. Chicago, Illinois, slept under a different winter. Snow lay piled in gray ridges along the streets, stained with exhaust and impatience. Brad stood in his glass-walled office overlooking the river, city lights reflecting off the ice-choked water below. He had rolled his sleeves up, revealing forearms unused to cold, fingers tapping against a stack of documents spread across his desk. Across from him sat Martin Klein, a forensic accountant with thinning hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the permanent stoop of a man who lived his life hunched over ledgers. Klein's suit was modest, his tie slightly crooked, his demeanor careful. "It's all legitimate," Klein said, adjusting his glasses, "or it was made to look that way. Over 30 years, Julian Walker funneled millions into marine engineering firms, custom fabrication shops, offshore contractors. Everything points to that property in Maine, Seawolf Ledge." Brad's eyes gleamed. "So the rock wasn't worthless." "Far from it," Klein replied. "Whatever he built out there was expensive and well hidden." Brad smiled, slow and sharp. Years of living in his cousin's shadow, first Ethan's physical presence, then his moral certainty, had left Brad with a particular hunger. He hated losing. More than that, he hated being underestimated. "Find me transport," he said, "and someone who doesn't ask questions." Back on the island, the night deepened. Sarah took a step back from the open cavity, instinct telling her that proximity carried risk. "You need to report this," she said. "Whatever your grandfather built, it's not just history. It's active." Ethan closed the stone slab as carefully as he had opened it, masking the seam with moss and snow until it vanished into the rock once more. "If I report it the wrong way," he said, "it disappears, or gets used for something it was never meant to do." Scout rose and moved to the edge of the ledge, body rigid, gaze fixed on the horizon. Ethan followed his line of sight. Far out on the water, a pinprick of light appeared, then another. Not the scattered glow of a fishing vessel, not the erratic bob of a buoy. These lights were steady, deliberate, cutting a path through the silver dark sea. As they drew closer, the shape resolved into the sleek outline of a yacht, large, powerful, its white hull catching moonlight like a blade. Sarah's breath caught. "That's not local," she said. "No one from Port Clyde owns something like that." The yacht adjusted its course, angling directly toward Seawolf Ledge. Scout let out a low, continuous growl, the sound vibrating through the cold air and into Ethan's chest. Ethan's grip tightened around the brass key hidden in his pocket. Whatever his grandfather had built beneath this rock was no longer a secret waiting to be uncovered. It was a prize, and someone had come to claim it. Had come. Morning arrived hard and bright, the kind of winter light that erased softness and exposed everything it touched. Snow continued to fall, but lightly now, dry flakes drifting sideways in the wind and catching the sun until the air itself glittered. Seawolf Ledge stood stark against the blue-white horizon, granite dark and uncompromising, the ancient tree casting a long skeletal shadow across the rock. Ethan was already awake, standing near the edge of the ledge in his Navy working uniform, watching the sea with the patience of a man used to waiting for threats that announced themselves only at the last second. Scout sat beside him, posture rigid, silver-gray fur bristling faintly along his spine, amber eyes locked on the distant line where water met sky. The yacht appeared just after sunrise, its silhouette clean and predatory against the light. It moved with confidence, engines low and controlled, cutting through the water as if the Atlantic itself had agreed to part for it. As it drew closer, details sharpened, polished rails, tinted windows, a hull too pristine for fishing or leisure. This was not a vessel that belonged to the rhythms of Port Clyde. It belonged to money and to intent. The yacht slowed as it entered the small cove beneath the ledge, dropping anchor with mechanical precision. A rigid, inflatable boat was lowered into the water, its black surface absorbing light. 3 figures descended into it. Ethan recognized the first immediately. Brad Carter stood at the bow, hands tucked into the pockets of an expensive insulated jacket that looked like it had never been tested by real cold. He was slightly hunched against the wind, his earlier confidence muted by the rawness of the place. In daylight, the contrast between him and the island was even sharper. His hair was perfectly styled despite the breeze, his face clean-shaven and pale, lips tight with irritation rather than fear. Brad had always been uncomfortable outside controlled environments, boardrooms, offices, places where power came from contracts instead of endurance. This island offered him none of that. Behind him stood Finn, a man in his late 30s with a compact, wiry build and restless energy. Finn's hair was cropped close to his scalp, revealing a scalp marked by old scars. His eyes darted constantly, never settling, his mouth set in a perpetual half-smirk that suggested nerves disguised as bravado. He wore tactical gear that looked new, purchased rather than earned, and carried himself like someone who talked faster than he thought. Beside him loomed Rook. Rook was the opposite. Tall and massive, shoulders broad enough to strain the seams of his dark coat, he moved with a heavy stillness that made the inflatable boat dip slightly beneath his weight. His head was shaved, his jaw square and shadowed with permanent stubble. His eyes were dark, unreadable, fixed straight ahead. He did not fidget, he didn't look around. Rook had the demeanor of a man who had learned long ago that silence was more intimidating than words. Something in his past, prison, war, or worse, had taught him to conserve motion and expression alike. The inflatable scraped against the stone landing. Brad stepped out first, boots slipping slightly on frost-slick rock. He recovered quickly, glancing up toward the tree and the house perched above with visible disdain. "So this is it?" he called out, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The crown jewel of the family estate." Ethan did not move from his position near the base of the tree. Scout rose slowly to his feet, placing himself half a step ahead of Ethan, his body a solid barrier of muscle and intent. The dog's ears were forward, his growl low and continuous, a sound felt more than heard. "Brad," Ethan said evenly, his voice carried easily in the cold air, "you shouldn't be here." Brad laughed, though it sounded thin. "Still telling people what they should and shouldn't do?" He spread his hands. "Relax. I came to talk. Family business." Finn snorted softly, glancing at Scout with poorly concealed unease. "That thing always looked like it's about to tear someone apart?" "He's deciding," Ethan replied. "Depends what you do next." Brad's smile tightened. He took a few careful steps forward, stopping well short of Scout's reach. "Let's not do this the hard way," he said. "I've been going through Granddad's finances. Turns out he spent a fortune out here, tens of millions over the years. Whatever he built, it's valuable, and I have people willing to pay for it." Sarah stood a short distance away, partially shielded by the tree's massive trunk. In the clear morning light, her face was pale, jaw set, eyes narrowed as she took in the scene. Her dark braid hung over one shoulder, dusted with snow. She said nothing, but her presence was a quiet reminder that this was no longer a private family confrontation. Ethan remained still. "You didn't come to talk," he said. "You came to take." Brad's expression hardened. "I came to claim what should have been mine in the first place." He gestured vaguely at the rock beneath their feet. "That technology, whatever it is, belongs to the family, and families make deals." He leaned closer, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "A foreign investment group has been watching maritime tech closely. They're very interested in passive listening systems. They don't care about patents or history, they care about results, and they pay well." The words landed like a physical blow. Ethan felt his jaw tighten, a familiar cold settling behind his eyes. This wasn't greed anymore. This was something uglier. "You're talking about selling military-grade surveillance technology," Ethan said, "to people you don't even know." Brad shrugged. "That's business. Don't be dramatic." Scout's growl deepened, vibrating through the frozen ground. His hackles rose fully now, silver-gray fur standing sharp against the white snow. His eyes never left Brad. Finn shifted his weight, hand brushing the grip of a concealed weapon. Rook took a single step forward, slow and deliberate, testing boundaries the way predators did. Ethan moved then, just enough to make his meaning clear. He stepped in front of Scout, posture straight, shoulders squared, the quiet authority of his uniform amplified by the stillness of the moment. "You're done here," he said. "Leave. Now." Brad laughed again, louder this time, but there was a crack in it. "You think you can stop this?" he snapped. "You're one man on a rock with a dog. You can't guard this place forever." At that moment, Scout lifted his head and howled. It was not a bark, not a warning growl. It was long and resonant, a sound that cut through the cold air and carried out across the water. It rose and fell like a siren, ancient and mournful, vibrating in Ethan's chest and echoing off the granite walls of the ledge. The sea responded. The surface darkened unnaturally fast, blue draining into bruised purples and greens. Far out on the horizon, a massive bank of clouds began to rise, thick and rolling, their undersides stained a violent violet gray. The wind shifted, sharp and sudden, whipping snow into spirals. Waves that had been calm moments before started to swell, their crests whitening as the water grew restless. Sarah inhaled sharply. "That storm wasn't forecast," she said, voice tight. "Not like that." Brad turned, staring at the horizon, color draining from his face. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "We'll wait it out on the yacht." But even as he spoke, the wind surged again, stronger now, and a distant rumble rolled across the water. Not thunder, but the deep, resonant growl of a sea waking up angry. Scout's howl faded into a low, urgent whine. He moved closer to Ethan, pressing his flank against the man's leg, eyes still fixed on the approaching storm. Whatever lay beneath Seawolf Ledge, whatever had once been built to listen and warn, knew what was coming. Ethan looked from the darkening sky back to Brad and his hired muscle. "You should have listened," he said quietly. The first heavy snowflakes fell then, large and wet, carried on a wind that smelled of salt and danger. The storm was coming fast, and no one on the island would leave unchanged. The storm struck without negotiation. One moment the sea was bruised purple beneath a hard winter sun. The next it rose in towering slabs, waves slamming into Seawolf Ledge with the force of artillery. Wind screamed across the rock, ripping snow from the ground and hurling it sideways in blinding sheets. The light did not dim. It intensified, reflecting off the airborne ice until the world looked overexposed, raw, every edge painfully clear. It was the kind of brightness that made danger impossible to ignore. Brad's confidence collapsed instantly. The polished businessman vanished, replaced by a man flailing against elements he had never learned to command. "We need shelter," he shouted over the wind, voice cracking as another wave detonated against the far side of the ledge. "Get inside, now!" Finn and Rook did not wait for further instruction. Finn bolted toward the spiral stairs, boots slipping as he slammed shoulder first into the treehouse door. The wood groaned but held. Rook followed more deliberately, bracing himself before striking with calculated force. The doorframe splintered, cracks spidering outward. Scout exploded into motion. The silver-gray German shepherd lunged forward, placing himself squarely between the attackers and the stairs, teeth bared, growl ripping from his chest like a living alarm. His eyes burned amber in the white chaos, every muscle locked, daring them to take one more step. "Scout, this way!" Ethan shouted, already moving. He did not run toward the treehouse. He ran toward the rock. Sarah hesitated only a heartbeat before following. The storm tore at her parka, dark braid whipping loose as she scrambled after Ethan. Fear showed in her face now, but beneath it was resolve, the stubborn grit of someone who had survived loss at sea and refused to surrender to panic again. Ethan dropped to one knee at the base of the ancient tree and tore away the thin veil of snow and moss concealing the hidden seam. He jammed the crowbar into place and heaved. The stone slab lifted with a grinding moan, just as another massive wave struck the ledge, sending spray cascading over them like shrapnel. "Down," Ethan ordered. Brad stared at the opening, disbelief warring with terror. "What is that?" "Your only chance to live," Ethan replied. "Move." Rook did not argue. He grabbed Brad by the collar and hauled him forward, practically throwing him into the cavity. Finn scrambled in after them, eyes wild. Sarah dropped down last, landing hard but upright. Scout leapt in beside Ethan, who followed and wrenched the slab back into place just as the treehouse door finally gave way behind them with a crack like a gunshot. The world changed instantly. The roar of the storm vanished as if someone had slammed a vault shut. Silence rushed in, thick and absolute, broken only by the sound of their breathing and the faint hum of something vast awakening beneath their feet. The passage sloped downward, smooth-walled and dry, illuminated by emergency lights that flickered to life as Ethan moved deeper. Brad stumbled, pressing a hand to the wall. What is this place?" he gasped. "A listening post," Ethan said, already moving with purpose. "Built to outlast storms." The tunnel opened into the main chamber, a cavernous space carved directly from granite. Banks of equipment lined the walls, preserved and pristine, their surfaces reflecting the cold white glow of overhead panels. A massive curved screen dominated the far wall, dark but waiting. The air was cool, sterile, circulating with a low, steady breath. Scout halted at the threshold, scanning the room before stepping inside, positioning himself near Ethan's leg with practiced precision. Ethan crossed to the central console and opened the oilcloth-wrapped journal, flipping to the marked pages with the muscle memory of someone following a mission checklist. He activated the primary power. The hum deepened, vibrating through the stone. Lights cascaded across the panels, amber shifting to green. The station woke like a giant roused from hibernation. The screen flared to life. The ocean appeared not as water, but as sound. Waves became pulsing bands of color. The storm above exploded into violent, chaotic noise, white and crimson interference that swallowed the upper frequencies. But beneath it, deeper and steadier, something moved. A dense, cold blue signature cut through the chaos, deliberate and controlled. Ethan leaned closer. His blood ran cold. A vessel, small, submerged, advancing toward the ledge, using the storm's acoustic fury as cover. A mini-submarine, its outline unmistakable to anyone trained to see patterns in noise. "No," Sarah whispered, "that's impossible." Brad sank onto the metal floor, shaking. His expensive jacket was soaked, hair plastered to his forehead, the last of his arrogance stripped away. "They said they'd wait offshore," he stammered. "They said—" Ethan turned slowly. "Who?" Brad swallowed hard. His eyes darted to the screen, then to Scout, who watched him with unblinking focus. "The investors," Brad said, voice barely audible. "They're not investors. They're procurement. They don't negotiate. They recover assets." Finn swore under his breath, or under his... Rook's jaw tightened, eyes flicking between the tunnel entrance and the glowing display. Even he understood what this meant. Ethan straightened, mind shifting gears. Above them, the storm battered the island to pieces. Below, an unknown force closed in, guided by technology Julian Walker had once feared would be misused. Ethan was trapped between two fronts, both lethal. "How long?" Sarah asked, forcing calm into her voice. "At this speed," Ethan said, eyes locked on the data. 15 minutes, maybe less. The station shuddered as another wave struck the ledge. Dust drifted from the ceiling, but the structure held. Julian had built well. Brad looked up at Ethan, something broken and desperate in his expression. "You have to shut it down," he pleaded. "If they can't find it—" "They already have," Ethan cut in. "They're following the sound of the storm being shaped by the rock itself. Turning this off won't make us invisible." Scout shifted, ears angling toward the tunnel, then back to the screen, reading the room with an intelligence that bordered on human. Ethan's gaze hardened. The realization settled fully now. This was not just a secret. It was a battleground, and running was no longer an option. Brad covered his face with his hands, voice cracking as the truth finally surfaced. "They're coming to take it," he said, "and they don't care who's in the way." The blue signature on the screen grew larger, closer. The hunt had begun. The storm did not end so much as it loosened its grip. The wind fell first, retreating in uneven breaths, and the snow thinned into slow, drifting flakes that glittered in the cold aftermath. Outside, Seawolf Ledge emerged battered but unbroken, washed clean under a brutal winter brightness. The light after the storm was sharper than before, merciless in its clarity, revealing damage without mercy and hiding nothing that moved. Inside the underground station, the world was quieter but far more dangerous. Ethan stood at the central console, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on the massive curved sonar display. His Navy working uniform was damp at the cuffs, darkened where salt water had soaked through, but he hadn't noticed. His posture had changed subtly since the storm began to ease, less reactive now, more deliberate. This was familiar territory, not the stone or the sea, but the pressure, the narrowing of options, the moment when fear became useless and clarity took over. On the screen, the chaotic roar of the storm's acoustics was slowly thinning. Colors shifted from violent whites and reds into more defined bands, and beneath them, unmistakable, the cold blue mass of the mini-submarine continued its approach. It moved with patience, adjusting course in small, efficient increments, like a predator circling before the strike. Sarah stood a few steps behind Ethan, arms folded tightly against herself, fingers pale where she gripped her sleeves. Up close, the strain showed clearly on her face. She was tall and lean, her frame wiry from years of hauling equipment and fighting tides, but exhaustion had carved faint hollows beneath her eyes. Her dark hair had slipped fully free of its braid, falling around her shoulders in damp strands. Still, her gaze was steady. She had learned, after losing her husband to an unexpected winter squall, that panic never saved anyone. Observation did. "They're not rushing," she said quietly. "That means they're confident." "They know exactly what they're looking for," Ethan replied, "and they know it can't run." Behind them, the mood was changing. Yeah. Brad Carter had pulled himself to his feet and was slowly circling the edge of the chamber, eyes flicking from console to console. The fear that had hollowed him out during the storm was being replaced by something more dangerous: calculation. In the clean, humming stillness of the station, surrounded by dormant technology worth more than anything he had ever owned, his breathing slowed. His shoulders straightened. Greed, unlike courage, came easily to him. Finn crouched near one of the server racks, pretending to steady himself, but clearly peering at blinking indicators with fascination. His wiry body vibrated with nervous energy, fingers twitching as if itching to touch something forbidden. He licked his lips often, a tell Ethan had noticed earlier, an old habit from stress and bad decisions. Rook stood apart from both of them, closer to the tunnel entrance. The massive man leaned slightly against the rock wall, arms crossed, expression unreadable. His dark eyes moved constantly now, measuring angles, exits, distances. Rook didn't care about the technology, he cared about leverage, and he was already thinking ahead to when control might shift. Ethan turned from the screen, his voice cut cleanly through the room. "Sit down, all of you." He pointed to the open floor space near the wall. "There, now." Finn froze. Brad opened his mouth, then closed it again when Scout stepped forward. The German Shepherd had positioned himself squarely at the base of the metal stairway leading deeper into the station, body rigid, head level, silver-gray coat catching the overhead light. At 5 years old, Scout was in his prime, powerful without excess, disciplined without hesitation. His amber eyes moved from face to face, assessing threat the way Ethan once had in hostile villages half a world away. His growl was low and constant, a reminder rather than a threat, One wrong move and the reminder would become a consequence. Brad swallowed and sat. Ethan returned to the console and opened a sealed communications panel. Beneath it lay older hardware, shielded and manual, untouched by modern networks. He entered a string of commands with practiced precision, fingers moving without hesitation. This was not something he had learned from his grandfather's journal. This was muscle memory from another life. "Are you calling the Coast Guard?" Sarah asked. "No," Ethan said. "Something that listens longer." He keyed in a burst transmission, encrypted using a legacy naval protocol few still remembered, routing it through the station's acoustic uplink. The message was short, brutal in its simplicity. Coordinates, severe weather conditions, and a single phrase coded in old fleet shorthand. "Hostile submersible. Asset compromised." He sent it. The system acknowledged nothing, no confirmation tone, no return signal. The message vanished into the sea like a prayer dropped into deep water. "That's it?" Sarah asked. "That's all there is," Ethan said. "Now we wait." Waiting did not come easily to Brad. Minutes passed, measured by the steady pulse of machinery and the slow crawl of the blue shape on the screen. The storm noise continued to fade, revealing finer details beneath the surface. Then Brad shifted. He reached into his jacket slowly, deliberately, eyes flicking toward Ethan, then toward Scout. His hand closed around his phone. Scout reacted instantly. The dog spun, teeth flashing as a sharp growl tore from his chest. His body tensed, weight shifting forward, ready to launch. Brad flinched hard, the phone slipping from his fingers and clattering across the metal floor. "Don't," Ethan said, voice dangerously calm. "Not again." Brad's face flushed red, anger flaring where fear had been. "You don't get to order me around," he snapped. "You think this makes you important? You're squatting on something you don't even understand." Rook moved then. He pushed himself off the wall and took a single step forward, massive shoulders rolling, testing the space. He did not look at Scout. He looked at Ethan. Finn scrambled backward instinctively, putting distance between himself and the dog. Ethan did not raise his voice. He did not move toward Rook. He simply met the man's stare, every line of his body projecting readiness. "Sit," he repeated, "or this ends badly for you." Rook hesitated. For a fraction of a second, something flickered behind his eyes, calculation giving way to recognition. He had seen men like Ethan before, men who did not bluff. Rook sat. The station shuddered faintly. Sarah turned back to the screen. "Ethan, there's something else." He followed her gaze. A new set of signals had appeared, smaller, faster-moving shapes clustered together, rising from below the blue mass of the submersible. Their acoustic signature was unmistakable. Human. Controlled ascent, breathing apparatus, precision. "Divers," Ethan said. "They're already at the rock," Sarah whispered. "They didn't wait for the sub." Ethan's jaw tightened. The attackers were splitting their approach. Pressure from below, entry from the foundation, professional, efficient. Scout's ears snapped toward the stone wall behind the console, his head tilting slightly as he listened to vibrations no human could hear yet. His growl returned, deeper now, vibrating through the floor. On the sonar screen, the diver signatures crept closer, clustering near a point directly beneath the station. "They're at the door," Sarah said. Ethan exhaled slowly, centering himself. Two fronts, one above, unstable humans driven by greed and fear. One below, trained operators with a mission and no reason to hesitate. He placed a hand on Scout's back, feeling the solid reassurance of muscle and warmth. "Hold them," he murmured. "Watch the stairs." Scout did not look at him. He didn't need to. Ethan turned back to the console, mind racing through options that grew thinner by the second. He could hear his grandfather's words in his head now, not as text but as intent. The watch is not passive, it is a responsibility. The blue diver signatures reached the threshold. The stone beneath their feet vibrated again, stronger this time. And then, somewhere deep within the rock, a locking mechanism began to turn. Winter noon arrived with a clarity so sharp it felt carved rather than lit. The storm had torn itself apart during the night, leaving behind a sky rinsed clean and mercilessly blue. Sunlight struck the sea at a hard angle, turning the Atlantic into a sheet of hammered metal that reflected light upward, flooding Seawolf Ledge with brilliance. Snow clung to every surface in bright, uneven patches, outlining damage, footprints, and truth with equal honesty. Nothing was hidden anymore. Inside the underground station, Ethan Walker stood motionless at the central console, breathing slow, shoulders squared, mind narrowed to essentials. The Navy working uniform he wore was stained and salt-stiffened now, no longer ceremonial in any sense, but it fit him the way purpose always had. He was calm, not because the danger had passed, but because it had fully revealed itself. This was the moment his grandfather had prepared for without ever naming. Scout stood at his side, 5 years old and fully aware of his role, silver-gray coat catching the overhead lights like frost on steel. His body was relaxed but ready, tail low, ears subtly shifting to track sounds above and below. He was no longer guarding out of instinct alone. He was holding a post. Ethan's fingers moved across the console, not frantic, not rushed. He opened a secondary system buried beneath layers of outdated interface, an acoustic modulation array his grandfather had designed not as a weapon but as a lens. Ethan adjusted frequencies, shaping the station's output to distort, amplify, and redirect sound. The goal was simple: make hiding impossible. If the intruders relied on stealth, he would strip it away. On the sonar screen, the diver signatures clustered tight near the foundation began to waver, their clean lines smeared into jagged arcs as the acoustic field shifted. The mini-sub's blue mass faltered, its approach slowing, course correcting too often, too late. "They're confused," Sarah said, stepping closer despite herself. In the bright light, her features looked sharper, more resolute. She was still tall and lean, parka unzipped now, cheeks flushed from cold and adrenaline. Her dark hair was a mess of loose strands, braid long gone, but her eyes were steady. Loss had taught her what chaos felt like. This was something else. This was control. Ethan nodded once. They have to surface to reorient or retreat. Above them, boots scraped against stone. Brad Carter stumbled out of the access tunnel first, blinking against the brightness, hands raised too late to look cooperative. He looked smaller now, expensive jacket hanging awkwardly on his frame, face gray and hollowed by fear. Finn followed, shaking, eyes darting wildly, and all bravado burned away. Rook emerged last, shoulders tense, jaw clenched, a man who understood consequences and knew when he'd reached the end of his leverage. Scout moved forward a single step. That was all it took. A Coast Guard cutter cut across the water below the ledge, white hull flashing in the sunlight, wake foaming behind it. Overhead, the low thrum of rotors grew rapidly louder, precise and unmistakable. A Navy transport helicopter crested the horizon, banking toward the island with disciplined confidence. The divers below never had a chance. Forced to surface by the distorted acoustics, they were bracketed between the cutter and a second gray vessel that slid into view like a closing door. Commands echoed across the rock. Weapons stayed lowered. Control was absolute. Brad sank to his knees without being told. Finn followed, hands trembling. Rook stood still until a Coast Guard officer placed a firm hand on his shoulder. He did not resist. Ethan watched it all without satisfaction. Justice was not something he celebrated. It was something he ensured. Minutes later, a small group climbed the ledge toward the tree and the ruined remnants of the old structure above the station. At their center walked a man in his late 60s, posture straight despite his age, white hair cropped close, eyes sharp beneath the brim of a Navy admiral's cap. His uniform was immaculate, untouched by the chaos around him. He stopped a few paces from Ethan and removed the cap. "Ethan Walker," he said, voice calm, steady. "I'm Admiral Thomas Hayes." Ethan straightened instinctively. Scout remained pressed against his leg, a solid, grounding weight. "I served with your grandfather," Hayes continued, eyes moving from the ancient tree to the weathered treehouse above, then back to the man and dog before him. "We always wondered what he was building out here. We knew it was brilliant. We didn't know it was this." There was no accusation in his tone, only respect. "The system beneath this rock is unique," Hayes said. "Irreplaceable and dangerous in the wrong hands." He paused, studying Ethan carefully. "Julian Walker refused to give it to us because he believed no institution could be trusted to listen without eventually wanting to strike. He believed in guardians, not owners." Ethan felt the weight of the words settle into place. For the first time, the phrase, "silent watch," made complete sense. "We can't abandon this station," Hayes went on, "and we can't run it like a black project." He met Ethan's gaze directly. "Your grandfather named you for a reason. We're prepared to offer you a civilian guardianship contract. You would operate the station independently. Report only threats, no data monetization, no offensive use. Sarah looked at Ethan then, something like hope flickering through the exhaustion on her face. Ethan turned his eyes toward the sea. The winter sun was high now, light pouring across the water until the horizon dissolved into brilliance. For years, he had lived with noise, memories, regret, the feeling of being a weapon without a war. On this rock, with this dog in this light, the noise was gone. Scout leaned harder into his leg, warm, heavy, real, a vow without words. "Yes, sir," Ethan said at last. His voice was steady. "I accept." Months later, the island bore careful changes. Where the old structure had failed, a reinforced observation post stood, clean lines, storm-rated, unobtrusive. But the treehouse remained. Ethan insisted on it. It stayed anchored in the ancient branches, repaired but unchanged, a place where wind spoke freely and memory was allowed to rest. On a clear winter afternoon, Ethan and Scout stood at the edge of the ledge, watching the sea breathe. They were no longer ghosts, they were sentinels. And the watch, silent, patient, and true, had begun again. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with thunder or blinding light. Sometimes they come quietly, through loyalty, through purpose, through a companion who refuses to leave your side when the world turns cold. In this story, the rock was never worthless, the storm was never random, and the dog was never just a dog. God works in ways we don't always recognize at first. He places us where we are needed most, even when it feels like loss, betrayal, or isolation. He gives us signs, not always through words, but through courage, conscience, and the quiet strength to stand watch when others turn away. In our daily lives, we may not guard a lonely island or face storms at sea, but we all face moments when doing the right thing feels harder than walking away. In those moments, remember this: you were placed there for a reason. Your watch matters, your choices matter, and you are never truly alone. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We read every one. And if stories of faith, loyalty, courage, and second chances speak to you, subscribe to the channel so we can continue this journey together. May God bless you, protect you, and guide your steps. May He watch over you and your loved ones, calm the storms you face, and remind you, just as He did here, that even in the coldest places, His purpose is still alive.